Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session for the Security Summit 2021 conference. I am Mohammed Ramich. I will be your moderator for the Inspector Clouseau Hall. It will be my pleasure to walk you through the conference and introduce you to speakers and companies that have come with us today to introduce us to their companies. Before we get started, I would like to express my sincere appreciation for everyone who has generously helped us to make this event come together to become a success. I thank you all for joining us today. Our first speakers here are representatives of Secura company, which is based in Netherlands and has been established in the year 2000. Ms. Anna Kurtović, who is the company's medior certification specialist, has over 5 years of work experience in the security field, and Mr. Razvan Venter, who is the managing product security group and the product security group within the Secura company. He has a vast experience that includes several years in top security evaluation laboratories. We appreciate you joining us today. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Mohammed, and thank you everyone for joining our presentation. We hope you'll like it, and it's going to be an interesting next hour for everyone in this session. Thank you again for joining. So, as Mohammed mentioned, Anna and myself will walk you in the session through the landscape of IoT security, especially from the point of view of standards and available security certification programs. Let's start with a bit of the agenda of what you will expect over the next roughly 45 minutes. Well, we'll start with a brief introduction about ourselves and about Secura, but we will not take that too extensive, because if you want to hear more information about the company, then feel free to visit our booth or our virtual booth for this conference. We will then dive into the topic of the presentation with a brief overview of the security threats applicable for IoT products, and that part will be presented by my colleague Anna. Then we will zoom in. We'll provide an overview on several most relevant standards, frameworks, and certification programs applicable for IoT, and we'll split at that point into multiple domains such as consumer devices, medical devices, automotive, and industrial. We will try to zoom in on a couple of them. Of course, time is limited, so we have to make a selection. So we will take a look at several very relevant standards and certification programs, such as Common Criteria, ETSI EN 303645, and ISC 6443. And we will try to explain you in a couple of slides for each, what are they about and what are their market relevance and value. And finally, we'll spend a couple of minutes at the end talking about the future of IoT security certification and the currently, let's say, in preparation harmonized schemes at European level. So let's get started. By the way, of course, I hope you have questions to discuss at the end, and please feel free to think about those questions. And let's spend the last minutes of this session to discuss about your possible topics. A bit about ourselves. It's a virtual conference, so unfortunately you can only see us on camera. My name is Razvan Venter. Within the Secura company, I'm managing the group called Product Manufacturers. Within this group, we are responsible for evaluating the security of all sorts of products, including both software as well as embedded devices and components from various type of domains, such as consumer devices, medical, smart vehicles, industrial, telco, and so on. My colleague Anna, she is involved in this team as well. She is a security certification specialist, and she is actively involved in projects dealing with security testing in line with the standard or certification of products in line with schemes such as, for example, Common Criteria. Very briefly about Secura as a company. Like I said, I will keep it short, and for any other further questions or discussions, we kindly invite you to visit our virtual booth, where you'll find our colleagues very eager to give you more details. Secura is a Dutch-based company. We have 2 offices. Both of them are located in the Netherlands. One of them is located in the capital, Amsterdam, and a second one in Eindhoven. Since this year, 2021, Secura is part of the Bureau Veritas group. Bureau Veritas being one of the major test inspection and certification companies worldwide. And Secura as a company has been founded in the year 2000, so we have a bit over 20 years of experience fully in the world of cybersecurity testing. Our core expertise lies with testing and pen testing on various types of applications, infrastructures, and also products. And we have a strong view in linking our testing services as much as possible to internationally recognized standards, frameworks, or certification programs. In this way, we are able not to provide only a simple pen test to your product or solution, but also to provide a relevant certificate or recognized report at the end of the assignment. Now, to dive deeper into the topic of today's discussion, we will start with a brief introduction of the security threats applicable to IoT products. And at this point, I will leave the floor to my colleague, Anna, for this next few minutes. Anna, please go ahead.
Thank you, Razvan, for the introduction, and on my behalf as well, welcome to everybody. Indeed, I've started at Secura as a penetration tester and then switched to certification specialist. So I'm now also involved in a lot of testing, but in a lot of things regarding threats in the spectrum of the devices and products that we test. Therefore, I would like to introduce kind of this rise of the IoT ecosystem. I think it's very much a hot topic today, and we all see the rise of the number and diversity and complexity of these devices. So this year, there's an estimate of 3.5 devices that are connected to the smart world per person, while in 10 years' time, it's going to be estimated to increase to 15 connected devices, resulting in 125 billion devices that are interconnected by 2030. As you may see, the numbers of the net worth of this industry are also super high, but what about their securities? What is the threat landscape that is waiting for us in this area of IT? So if we zoom in into the photo on the picture on the left side, we have split it into industrial, or the Internet of Things. We're talking energy, automotive, transportation, manufacturing, and agriculture. All these interconnected sensors, instruments, and similar devices network together with computers' industrial applications. And on the right-hand side, you can see the consumer IoT, meaning smart homes, smart appliances, wearables, hearables, entertainment devices. It doesn't matter whether it's your watch or is it your fridge telling you how many ingredients you need for tomorrow. Basically, almost anything that was connected to a power supply today comes in a smart version. And if that was not enough, on top of that, we have something in between that is a very hot topic called the cloud, but in the very bare essence of it, it's just somebody else's computer that is handling your data. So if we can already see how vast the threat landscape is of the IoT devices, but let's pick out a device and zoom in to one on the next slide and see what would be the threats of a common, for example, IP camera. Well, it's not only an IP camera, of course. Usually these production of IP cameras come into a whole surveillance package. So what does it consist of? If we take just the IP camera, it comes with this management interface, usually in the form of a web application. Most often we see such web applications are not built with security in mind because they're not meant to be publicly available, but just as local configuration management interfaces. Then, of course, it has its own firmware. Some cameras come with internal storage, may come or not. Usually these devices are interconnected with a network video recorder that also has its own firmware version and also its own software, because you have to access somewhere to review the footage, to rewind, to configure the management, also a configuration management interface. And of course, it has an internal storage for data. Or the IP camera solutions most recently also come with cloud solutions, which then again store your data, and then that data is accessed by remote monitoring devices. So that is, of course, definitely not it, because these cameras and these systems are often containing physical ports such as Ethernet ports or audio-video transmission ports. These networks are more complex in real life. They're connected with different types of cameras, for example, outdoor and indoor cameras that are not the same devices, not the same firmware. They're connected through complex networks via switches, et cetera, et cetera. So the real attack surfaces is way wider than what we're talking about now. But let's go through some of them. For example, attacks on the firmware. Was it modified before it was flashed on the device? Are the updates and patch management, is it cryptographically signed? Are there checks during the boot sequence? Are the ports, the debug ports disabled on the motherboards or the integrated circuits of the devices. The communications, of course, are, is it cable or airborne, it doesn't matter, but there is some Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, NFC, RFID, Zigbee communication. Is it secured? Is it, can it be read? Is it sent unencrypted or encrypted? Can it be read by a man-in-the-middle attack, for example? Then I've already told about these web app interfaces. They're not usually built with security in mind. So we often find hard-coded passwords. We find credentials that are easily guessable or can be brute forced, and etc. Again, the physical security, where is this NVR located? If you put all software security in mind, but somebody comes and plugs out the hard drive and plugs it into another computer, then we have an issue there as well. And in the end, there are logs and events. If somebody sprays over the camera, is there alarm that is going to be raised? There are so many things to be considered in this from the perspective of security. So where do we start? How can we grasp what to do to protect our IoT devices? Razvan, if you could continue to the next slide, please. Well, first, let's talk about the difference between the attacks on the consumer IoT devices versus the attacks on the industrial IoT devices. What this very much translates to the physical world. One is a burglar trying to rob your house, and the other one maybe is an organized crime group, of course, because in the consumer IoT attackers, we can think about the Nigerian prince that has updated his hacking skills to meet the modern times. And on the other hand, with industrial IoT, we're talking about espionage, we're talking about organized groups of hackers or state-level actors with high motives and resources. And we often now see that these are starting to be interconnected, because what happens when the hearables and wearables and your smartwatch and your phone and everything enters the workspace? We have to really start paying more attention to the security of these devices and at least ensure some bare minimum that has to be some sort of checklist bare minimum that has to be implemented in these devices to ensure security. This is why it's necessary to take into consideration various certificates and standards that can help you in ensuring this, and Razvan can introduce you to some of them.
Thank you very much, Anna, for setting the scene about various state-of-the-art threats applicable to IoT and the IoT security in particular. Indeed, let's now use the next slot in this presentation to provide a brief overview of what you could expect in this world of IoT cybersecurity in terms of relevant standards, frameworks, and certifications. First of all, maybe it's good to start with the question, why standards? Why do we want to talk about them, and why are they important? And in order to understand this, we have to start from the so-called IoT cycle. So what is normally the way in which various attacks happen, various threats happen, and what is that triggering? So normally it all starts with a trend, and the current trend, as we see day after day, is that IoT, what we currently call IoT, is getting bigger and bigger. A few years ago, whenever we were talking about IoT, people were mostly thinking about home gadgets, smart connected products like lights, alarms, and so on. So personal gadgets. But nowadays, it's actually quite common to understand IoT from its broader perspective. So consumer devices, but also connected vehicles, connected industrial products, medical, cloud on top of everything, web, mobile applications, everything that has any kind of port or physical connection to the internet is part of the IoT. So the IoT is really ever growing, and this is truly a fact. However, together with that, of course, the hackers, the dark minds, to call them this way, of this world, they are also not passive. They are constantly trying to find new vulnerabilities, new backdoors into trying to attack those connected products. And sometimes it's not very trivial, because many IoT developers are taking security already well into account. But sometimes it is possible, because especially small companies and companies who are trying to take the effort from security and put it fully on the functionality part of the product, sometimes they are cutting their budgets linked to cybersecurity, and this is how backdoors could end up in products. And this is not a theory anymore. We see it year after year, and even more often, even month after month, demonstrated attacks and practice either on consumer devices, but even more importantly, on high-risk products such as medical devices or industrial infrastructures. So taking this cycle into account, the next question that we could be asking ourselves is, okay, then what to do? Are we stuck a bit in a circle because developers are taking a look at the regulators and they're telling them, well, maybe you should be enforcing laws about cybersecurity, and then we'll be following them. Regulators are taking a look at the users and they are saying, if we would ensure those kind of rules and regulations in place, then your products will probably get a bit more expensive, and then maybe users will not be interested in buying them anymore. And on the other hand, users, and most of the times a regular user without any education or expertise in cybersecurity, they don't know what to look at. So they're fully relying on manufacturers to embed those kind of security controls into their product. It's an absolute trust. So that's why it feels we are a bit stuck in this circle of pointing fingers towards who should start. And the unfortunate truth at this point is that most of this needs to be driven by the manufacturers themselves in embedding sufficient security controls into their products. But then, of course, the question is how to start. What is sufficient controls? When to start? When to end? And how do you know that you have reached the exact sweet spot in which you can say, this is sufficient security for my device? Here is where, at Secura, as mentioned also in the beginning, we have always believed in the power of standards. It's not only because they are interesting and nice to read publications, but also because when you open a standard, especially an internationally recognized one, you're not opening the point of view only of one person or one group or one company, but you're opening the opinion and point of view of thousands of people from various places in the world who have thought together, reviewed each other's work, taken into account state of the art, and finally put on paper a set of requirements or security controls that could be implemented in order to ensure the state of the art. So you are choosing for validated content and common language and common goals, common security objectives. And this is why we actively promote this approach on relying on standards or frameworks as internationally recognized as possible, so as broad as possible, in order to guide developers in implementing sufficient security into their products. But that being said, of course, it's not easy to find the ideal standard. Sometimes it feels like whenever you look like you'll find 10 more standards. So picking the actual relevant one is definitely not an easy task. What I would like to propose over the next few slides is to take a very quick look at what is the current standardization environment across a few domains. And let's start with the consumer IoT one. So our smart gadgets, everything that connects to our home network, what to expect from point of view of regulations, standards, but also certification options. Also, we will split those slides into 2 dimensions to cover both the American market and European market. So consumer IoT wise, from a point of view of regulation, in America, we have already a regulation in place. It's only in one state, in California, and it's honestly quite minimal. It's just asking for a minimum of passwords and the vulnerability disclosures. And we have several similar initiatives also in the European Union, such as the Radio Equipment Directive or a local initiative in the UK, also asking for minimum security controls such as password management. Standard-wise, we have the first bullet here called the ETSI EN 303645. We'll take a better look at it later on in this presentation, and other publications such as ISC 62443 or UL 2900, which all could be used as relevant sources to extract meaningful controls for your products. And finally, talking about certification, on top of the ETSI standard, you can certify your products. And also we have the so-called Common Criteria Certification Program, which is an IT-specific certification tool. It can be used for consumer devices, but also for other types of products. And once again, later on in this presentation, we will spend some more time on explaining briefly what Common Criteria is. That was from the point of view of consumer IoT devices. Switching domains to the industrial side, industrial control systems, it's actually a bit worse because regulation-wise, there is nothing to mandate the need of cybersecurity as a baseline, as a minimum level in those kind of products. Regarding standards, we do have a couple, and I would put a special emphasis on IEC 6443, which we'll again see a bit more in detail later on, which is a particular standard for highlighting cybersecurity in the industrial domain. And certification-wise, we have a certification scheme that runs on top of the 62443 standard. We will explain it a bit later on. And once again, we have common criteria as a possible tool for ICS product manufacturers to certify their products from a security perspective. Keeping our walk around, we reached the automotive domain. Here, actually, we have a quite good regulatory environment. The whole European Union is covered by a regulation governed by the UNECE. And this regulation is specifically targeting cybersecurity in vehicles, both from a product perspective, the vehicle itself, as well as from a development processes perspective. So it's quite a broad regulation, so which is actually a very nice place, a very nice thing. In America, currently, we don't have an equivalent. However, we know that they are working on a local regulation for vehicles. Standard-wise, this will be slightly out of scope for this talk because we can open a much broader discussion, of course, about it. It's a very specific topic. But regarding the development processes for cybersecurity, we recommend the ISO 21434 standard. And finally, common criteria, once again, can be used very well for evaluating and certifying automotive components like ECUs. And finally, in my overview, we reach medical devices, so smart healthcare. Again, a very well-regulated domain from a security perspective, both in America as well as in Europe. In America, we have those kind of minimum cybersecurity regulatory requirements from the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And in Europe, those are governed by the so-called EU MDR, medical device regulation, that also incorporates security controls. The good part is that the IEC 62443 standard is found in this list of recommended standards as well. So we see something common with consumer devices and industrial products. And as mentioned, we will zoom in briefly on the standard to get more details about it. And certification-wise, those kind of products could be certified based on IEC 62443, but also based on common criteria or UL 2900. So there are several options in place to test all those sorts of IoT products in line with recognized standards and in line with certification schemes. Now, this is what I normally call the trust chain. So how do standards, frameworks, and certifications fit together, and how can you leverage the value from one level to another? Well, normally, when you are a developer just starting to experiment with cybersecurity, then you are all the way on the left-hand side. You have no process in place. The moment when you decide to follow a standard or an international publication to guide your security development, what you could say without spending too much effort is that you make a claim. We claim that our products are developed in line with the IEC 62443 standard. What does that mean? It's actually not very clear because the developers don't demonstrate anything. They just claim that, yes, we have taken into account this and that standard, and we have developed our product. Most of the times you can actually see that the way in which those are taken into account is not fully and just selectively, which is why a claim is never a very strong statement. One level deeper, of course, you have what is called compliance. Compliance means that the developer not only has studied a particular standard or framework to get inspiration for the security controls, but also has asked either a third-party company or their own internal cybersecurity team to perform testing in line with the requirements of the standard and demonstrate that the product indeed is compliant to all of those requirements and scope. And they can show you as a user the actual report on demand to demonstrate, yes, all those requirements have been taken into account and our product is compliant. One level deeper is, of course, certification. The issue with compliance is that if it is done by the developer itself, it is more of a self-assessment. So then you could argue that, the developer was biased, there was no independence in place. How can I make sure that those reported results are actually true? Certification, of course, helps in that, in the sense that those certifies issued as a result of a certification program are not issued by the developer, but they're issued by independent, trusted partners, trusted companies who have been designated and accredited to perform this exact sort of testing. And therefore, whenever you choose to trust a certificate, you don't trust just the declaration of the developer, but you trust the company who was accredited to perform this kind of testing, and you know that they are qualified to do this job. So it's, of course, much stronger than a simple compliance or a simple claim. Finally, we have maybe the ultimate level, which honestly, not in all domains we have reached yet. It's called harmonized certification. You could argue that there are different certification schemes, maybe in America, in Europe, in South America, and so on. And at one point, we have the issue of market fragmentation. Which certification scheme to believe? Is it easier to get certified in Europe rather than in America? Maybe yes, maybe not. And this is where harmonization between certification is very important. Imagine if we would have not 25 certification schemes in Europe, but only one, and therefore the result is recognized in all the countries. That will be amazing. This is where we're currently going, and the last part of this presentation will briefly take a look at two proposed harmonized certification schemes across the European Union. But before we get to that point, let's briefly zoom on several examples that we have selected to explain you a bit more how certification would work in practice. And the first stop in this set would be common criteria, where I will give the floor once again to Anna for a brief explanation. Anna, feel free to go ahead.
Thank you, Razvan. Indeed, let's talk about common criteria. So common criteria is a standard that is derived from several standards that are 30 or even longer years in existence in the IT domain. So it is a very well-known standard and is a very recognized within internationally recognized standard. So basically, it is an international standard for computer security certification to certify various types of IT products. In the following slide, we will see the three types of products that are certified under the common criteria: general types of IT products, and then smart cards and similar devices, and hardware devices with security boxes. So these are the three types of IT products that are certified, and depending on what type of product that you as a vendor have, it also depends on what type of what level of certification you will go for, which will we see in the following slide. So how does common criteria work? Well, basically you as a vendor can claim about some make claims about some security features that are present in your product. My camera, nobody can touch the video, it is 100% secure. As a laboratory has to test those claims and check if what the vendor claims is indeed true. Oh, indeed, nobody can touch this video footage. Of course, these claims are checked to a certain level of assurance. The assurance levels in common criteria range from 1 to 7, and the coverage and the depth of the evaluation activities increases the higher the selected EAL level gets. This means at level 1, the evaluation will have the lowest associated volume and depth of evaluation, and of course, the higher the levels go, the evaluation itself requires more time, it's more costly, it also requires on your side more documentation and detail level of documentation, and on the side of the laboratory, more tests within the product. But what it also means that the higher the level, the assurance level goes, the product is less dependent on its operational environment and more robust against higher skilled threat agents. If you remember what we've talked about in the threat landscape regarding consumer IoT devices versus industrial IoT devices. So if you're, for example, a manufacturer of a smart light or a smart fridge, you can safely aim at evaluation assurance level 1 to 3. If you're dealing with, for example, surveillance systems or cameras, you should probably target somewhere between 3 and 4. But however, if you're working with smart cards or devices that are required to operate at high-risk environments, you have to look at higher evaluation assurance levels for common criteria. But how to choose your evaluation level, basically, you have to consider the current security maturity of your product. You also have to check your competition because, of course, your competitors and vendors and developers of similar devices also may have this certification, so you can see what you need to compete with. You have to keep your budget in mind, of course, because these evaluations get very much costly the higher the levels are, and you have to think about the operational environment in which your target device is intended to operate. So let's take where to start with common criteria. Well, we start for something called the security target. Basically, this is the base document on which all other evaluation activities are based on, and what it has in mind, the main highlights of what it contains is something called the product overview. You have to describe the typical functionality of your product. What does it do? You include the typical usage, and of course the scope, because it's very difficult, for example, to evaluate the cloud part of it. You don't have much control over that part, so the scope really has to be clearly defined of what parts of your device are certified under the common criteria. Another thing that the security target consists of, on the next slide, is the security problem definition. So basically, you have a list of threats that the product addresses. For example, an attacker may try to manipulate the video and change it with a man in the middle of attack, intercept it or delete it, for example. You have to take into consideration all the security policies that apply to your device. For example, the web application, the management small web application, well, it has all the passwords for all users have to contain minimum 12 characters. This is all listed also in the security target. For example, assumptions about the operational environment. Attackers have no chance to connect any malicious devices to the local network of the target evaluation. Well, that's an assumption on where the devices are going to be placed and what kind of operational environments they're going to work in, and security objectives for the product. For example, the firmware image during loading is going to be verified by the target of evaluation in terms of integrity and authenticity. Now we're going to start talking about a bit more formal language. This is language that can be found in the common criteria documentation, something that are called security functional requirements of your device, meaning the security functionality will detect, when I will translate it to a bit more understandable language, the security functionality of a device of the product will detect when 5 unsuccessful authentication attempts occur relating to the administrators attempting to authenticate remotely. For example, if you have a remote management interface, then if somebody tries to log in with an admin user account and does not get the right password for 5 times, that account will be locked out for example, 5 minutes in this account. These are examples that have been taken out of actual security targets for a camera, IP camera system. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about security assurance requirements. Now, these requirements are more on the side of the certification laboratory, at least the responsibility of them, but indeed they have to be listed in the document called the security target, meaning that, for example, in this brief overview here, you have to see that the security target contains the descriptions, the things that we just talked about, contains the descriptions of the product, what does the product do, the normal intended usage of it, and this all makes sense. So these are some things that are assurance requirements. Of course, this is not everything that the security target contains, but these are kind of the most important bits and pieces. And this is a document that you have to start with. You can create a security target yourself. You can also hire a consultancy to help you with creating the security target. And on the next slide, once the security target is done, we will see what are the following steps in the certification procedure and how does it go. Basically, it goes within several meetings where deliverables and evaluation activities are performed. There are a lot of meetings between the laboratory and the vendor, and then we switch to meetings between the laboratory and the certification body in the end that gives you the certificate, that also has to check that the laboratory has performed their activities of evaluation in a correct manner and to a sufficient level of depth. So the evaluation activities are basically performed in several areas that you can see on the left-hand side, the security target being one of the most important parts that we've just talked about. Then evaluation activities on the development documentation, meaning the architectural description of the target evaluation, describing all the security features of your product, all the systems and subsystems that it contains, all the interfaces. Think of physical and logical interfaces, anything that talks to anything else, basically where information is exchanged, be it the web app, be it an Ethernet port, be it a terminal used to configure something. All of these things have to be listed and evaluated. Then guidance documentation, of course, manuals, user manuals, how is your product used, administration guidance, for example, if you have a client server architecture, how is this to be deployed and installed in a correct and safe manner, and secure delivery procedures and installation of the product that I just now mentioned. Then evaluation activities go through lifecycle support, meaning the versioning of your product. What happens if you push new code, patch a bug? Do you use Git? Do you safely push it? Who is authorizing it? Who can do changes on the product? All change management, production procedures, even if it's a physical production facility. All of these things are considered in the life cycle support phase of evaluation, and the certification ends with testing. First one is functional testing, meaning if you claim the application, you need to enter credentials, and there is authorization and authentication schemes in functions in my product that ensure that only authorized people can access some set functionality. The tests are performed basically to ensure that such functionality is present as claimed by the vendor. And in the end, we end with my favorite bit, and that's the vulnerability assessment, actually the penetration testing. So we see how strong those measures are, and can we bypass those security functionalities. Of course, depending on the evaluation level that we talked about before, the depth of these are defined. So scope of testing, for example, a software product, we do brute force attacks, injection attacks, XSS, we can just do the whole OWASP top 10, and scope of testing with hardware products on the next slide. For example, fuzzing, side channel attacks, communication protocols, exposed ports, all of these checks. It consists of a public vulnerability and independent vulnerability analysis, so quite extensive penetration testing is also required. On the following slide, so you may see that this is quite a lot to do and quite a lot to go through with the common criteria. So what is the market value and the international recognition of the standards? Well, definitely it's gonna, as I said, it's a very well-known standard. It's gonna make your product better positioned in the market. The certification is accepted on an international level. Overall, we find a lot of security vulnerabilities during this procedure, and in the end, you get a product that is safer for your consumer, and the validity of the issued certificate is 5 years, and meaning that you do not have to do a quick recertification, and you have possible advantages over your direct competitors. However, this standard is very deep and very complex and requires a lot of time and effort. There are a bit less, let's say, standards that you can go for that require a bit less effort, and one of them is ETSI N303645, which will be introduced by my colleague Razvan.
Thank you very much, Anna, for explaining briefly about common criteria. Indeed, let's continue our journey by moving towards the consumer domain, more towards the consumer IoT domain, and zoom in on the ETSI EN303645 standard. Well, as probably you got the impression in the previous part of the presentation shared by Anna, common criteria is a very good option, very well recognized, however, not the easiest and most straightforward thing that you could get in terms of security testing and certification. And that was one of the things that were recognized, especially on the consumer IoT side. Therefore, introducing the need for creating a more simpler baseline, a minimized set of security controls, a minimized set of requirements based on which even startup companies who are developing IoT products can get a product tested and certified. That being said, the baseline of the basis of the standard has been made back in 2019, and last year we had the first released version of the standard. It is an EN standard, an European norm, which means that once it is published, then it carries the obligation to be recognized across all the countries in the European Union. So that highlights from the beginning its value. It will be very internationally recognized. The standard itself aims to be, as mentioned, the baseline, and is split into 14 categories of requirements, which include both technical security controls, which could be testable and evaluated, as well as process and usability related requirements. So let's quickly scroll through those examples of the requirements to start with the technical ones. From a technical controls perspective, you could expect the, let's say, regular things that come to mind whenever talking about cybersecurity in a product. So things like passwords, security of software updates, secure storage and transfer of data, minimizing attack surfaces or validation of input data. Those are all elements that are asked by the ETSI standard on applicable on an IoT product. Process-wise, the focus is especially on things that are very interesting, especially for consumer devices that have a very high-paced life cycle. So we always get software updates, sometimes almost every week, almost every month. You have a new software update on a product. Therefore, the process which is deployed to develop and release software updates, and also the process that deals with patch management and vulnerability management, is something very important for those kind of vendors and those kind of products. Therefore, in the standard, you will get the requirements that deal especially with the software updates products process, vulnerability disclosure process, and so on. Then, of course, the most important question is how to evaluate, how to test based on the standard. We have seen previously that common criteria is not easy. Common criteria requires a lot of effort, a lot of time. The main idea behind the ETSI standard is to make this burden as simplified, as minimized as possible. A smooth process is aimed for, and that means that as much as possible, the evaluation will be done based on document review, documentation, and design analysis, with also a limited time box focused on testing and pen testing. So how would that work? From a document and design review perspective, everything that can be analyzed by the security testing lab will be done in this way, including also review of, for example, component fact sheets, schematics, PCB layouts, key management tables. So everything that would be able to speed up the whole process by checking it on paper in the design shared by the developer, instead of going into extensive and time-consuming evaluation and testing approaches. Then from a testing perspective, of course, it is still a technical standard, so we cannot escape testing, but testing can be seen and should be seen in a more minimized time box perspective, which is focused on validation testing of the security controls in place. And you can refer to the previous slide where we had some examples of what security technical functionalities the standard is asking for, but also a minimized time box for pen testing, which include things like, for example, password brute forcing, physical access, fuzzing, and or resistance to denial of service attacks, just to give you some examples. The good news is that the standard is already well recognized internationally, and there are some countries in Europe, but also outside of Europe, which are accepting and are providing certifications based on this. One example is coming from Europe, in Finland, driven by Traficom, the Finnish National Cybersecurity Center. And a second example that we highlight is from Singapore, driven by the Security Agency of Singapore. And furthermore, of course, there are private certification schemes that run on top of the standard, such as the one driven by Bureau Veritas, based on which customers can get a certificate for their IoT product. Of course, this we will tackle in a couple of minutes as part of the future reference and harmonized schemes. But currently, as in Europe, we are talking about the introduction of the Cybersecurity Act and a harmonized scheme for IoT vendors. The ETSI norm is considered to be, at this point, one of the main candidates for becoming the baseline of such harmonized European certification. Now, let's switch again and jump into the area of industrial and spend a couple of minutes on the ISC 62443 standard. The ISC 62443 standard, maybe the first thing to start with is the fact that it is not only a single standard, but a family of standards. As we can see here in this picture, there are in total 13 standards that the family consists of. And those standards are focused on a couple of domains, such as industrial components and systems, so more on the technical side, then also industrial solutions, but also on the process side, development processes for systems and components, as well as review of internal asset owners' internal processes or cybersecurity management systems. So let's quickly scroll through those example of standards. The 62443-4-2 part is actually one of the most popular in this domain. It's focused on components, industrial components testing. It includes security controls such as user authentication, authorization, so role separation, those kind of products. The security, confidentiality, and integrity of data that those products are handling, security of their interfaces, and robustness to potential external attacks. Also, the standard allows for 4 different levels of evaluation and certification for industrial components. Looking on a system side, actually the good news is that this part of the standard is very similar with the one on components. Of course, the main difference is that whenever we talk about a component, it's a single embedded product, a box, a connected box. And when we're talking about a system, it is a complex element consisting of multiple zones. So the accent of the standard is focused much more on how to deal with various zones and how to make sure that the system itself is implementing sufficient security controls. Quickly on the more process-related parts of the standard, to start with the 62443-2-4, this is focused on industrial solutions. And especially from a process perspective, things like secure installation resolution, incident response, training, and maintenance will be covered. And very well linked to this, we see the part of the standard that is dealing with development processes. So, for example, secure design, and the construction, production of a product, testing, things like versioning, patch management, but also more on the asset owner perspective. So, industrial organizations, processes like roles and responsibilities, security zoning of your system and organization, threat modeling, those are taken into account. So as you can see, the 6443 is a very robust, very complex family of standards, very well suited for the industrial domain, but also with applicability, for example, in other high-risk products such as connected medical devices. Now, as promised, let's spend the last part of our talk on the so-called future of IoT certification. So far, we have zoomed in on a couple of selected certification programs, such as Common Criteria, ETSI EN 303645, and ISC 6443. Also, a bit ago, we talked about fragmentation, so the fact that there are various schemes all around, and it might be a bit hard to determine which one is the best. Now, the good news is that within Europe, especially, there's a current initiative of harmonizing all of those schemes into single ones, which are much easier to understand and much broad in recognition. To start with the so-called EU Common Criteria scheme, the good news is that we don't have to re-understand the scheme from scratch, because it is fully based on the Common Criteria ideas and objectives that were shared by Anna a couple of minutes ago. But the main idea is that this harmonized EU-level Common Criteria scheme will eliminate the need of local Common Criteria initiative across the European Union. So we'll not be talking about Common Criteria certification in the Netherlands, in the Netherlands, France, Germany, or so anymore, but about single EU-level Common Criteria certification. So of course, that will be much more efficient from all points of view, actually. The idea of this EU Common Criteria scheme is that currently it is in the final draft phase, and it is aimed to become live somewhere in the second half of next year. So up to that point, you can still rely on the classical Common Criteria approach, but from next year, we will be looking at harmonized Common Criteria certification, meaning that a single evaluation will result in recognition across the whole European Union, much more attractive for developers. The new scheme will be based only on 3 levels, as opposite to the 7 levels that were presented by Anna before. So we will not have 7 levels of Common Criteria, but only 3 levels called basic, substantial, and high. And from a mapping perspective of the 7 levels of the classic Common Criteria to those 3 levels, we can keep the discussion pretty simple at this point. There's, of course, we could say more about it, but in principle, the mapping will be done based on the level and amount of pen testing that is performed on the level, on the product in scope. Pen testing, as mentioned by Anna before as well, deals with the amount of effort, tools, and time that you spend trying to break the security of a product. And the lower levels of penetration testing in the classic Common Criteria scheme will be allocated to the substantial level of the new scheme, while if you need to spend more time in trying to break the security of a product, then this will end you up with a high certificate for your product. So again, good for manufacturers to know what to select in terms of their end result certificate. In general, all the requirements of the classic Common Criteria will apply. Finally, there are just 2 additions, and those are linked with vulnerability and patch management. Common Criteria in a classic view is fully linked to a single version of a product, and if you have updates to that version, then those will be out of scope and recertification will be needed. In the next evolution of the scheme, the harmonized approach, also the process of patch management and vulnerability management will be taken into scope, which means that the process will be evaluated, certified, and based on this process, you will be allowed as a developer to also push new software updates without breaking your certificate. So again, one more benefit for developers who are interested in harmonized Common Criteria certification. And well, as mentioned before, this new scheme will eliminate all the differences between current national schemes, and it will create a level playing field for all developers to perform and obtain Common Criteria certification at EU level. Which brings us to the last topic that we would like to highlight. It's a similar initiative, but this time focused on the industrial domain. So common criteria is something very generic for IT products in general. You can think about operating systems, databases, more on the software side, but also network elements, industrial products, medical devices on more embedded side. However, there will be also an initiative at European level for industrial component certification. This is at this point a bit less mature than the EU common criteria one, and therefore the timelines will be also delayed. If for common criteria we were talking about middle of next year, then for the industrial certification scheme, we'll probably talking about 2023 most likely. However, at this point, there was already work being done at European level in providing some guidelines, some initial recommendations on how such a scheme can be established. This report is public and you can download it to check how the current guidelines for the scheme are being set into place. In general, some interesting takeaways are linked to the expected levels of certification. And again, those will be the same, basic, substantial, and high, which is, by the way, another benefit of those harmonized schemes. They will always end up with only those 3 levels, again, fighting against the fragmentation of various schemes. And from an evaluation activities that could be expected for those schemes, we can see a nice leveling here for basic. So for the entry level of certification, we have basic documentation review and basic process review. And as we go higher and higher, we see more and more testing, more and more vulnerability analysis, code review, and pen testing added to the scope. So the deeper you get, the more extensive the evaluation will become as well. Finally, how to prepare for the scheme. Well, at this point, there's no solution that could be clearly followed or recommended by the European Union for the scheme. So they don't say something like follow IEC 6443 and then you'll be compliant with this. However, let's say implicitly, the guidance document points towards IEC 6443-4-2 standard as a very good reference publication for preparing ICS component manufacturers in order to become compliant with the scheme once the scheme will become live. So long story short, if you follow the standard that we briefly introduced a few slides ago, then you are also fully prepared for whenever this harmonized European scheme will come into place. And this brings us to the end of our presentation. We hope that you have enjoyed our walkthrough various domains of IoT with applicable standards, regulations, and certifications, a bit of zoom in on several use case examples, and a brief look towards the future of harmonized certification. And I thank you very much. And at this point, we are very happy to answer your questions if those are available.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. We appreciate your time. However, I would strongly suggest those that are watching to use this opportunity to ask questions. In case you are not able to construct a question at this moment, I do advise you to connect with Anna and Razvan on the Connect2B platform and their company as well. So yeah, all right. I would like to ask like one common question for myself. That would be, what would be the most common security threat that companies may face and are exposed to? And what could Secura actually offer to prevent that?
Thank you. Would you like to try this one, Anna, more from an, let's say, application and software perspective?
No problem. Unfortunately, year after year, there's something called OWASP Top 10, and it barely changes. For past X years, it barely changes. It covers the same vulnerabilities that still stay in top of it. There are small changes that are solved with things such as browsers get updated. So yes, but usually it's a publicly exposed resources are the first line of offense, I think, towards these companies. So what do we offer? Of course, this is not the only thing. There are attacks on web applications, attacks on infrastructure, and then of course attacks on such things such as the devices themselves. We have seen last year several very major breaches that have happened in devices used by, for example, VPN solutions that we've seen, like Pulse VPN vulnerabilities that were used by a lot of major companies. Then we've seen solar panel vulnerabilities that are also used physically and that were backdoored in vast networks. Anyway, we can help indeed in finding these issues, helping you define what are your crown jewels. Let's say what are your main assets that you want to protect. Then we can help with doing a threat modeling session to find what to do and what threats you should counter. And we can round it up with penetration tests, of course, and see if the security solutions that you have in place are actually sufficient, or discover new ones, of course, and in the end give recommendations on how to fix those security issues. And on the other hand, we also have a huge issue of human error. That is something that is very difficult to counter, and you can make your systems and emails and interfaces and infrastructure and web applications as secure as possible, but still, if somebody clicks on that phishing link, yeah. Indeed. So we do also offer security awareness programs on that case, on that side. And in the end, in the certification team that I am in part of now, of course, the certification solutions that we've talked about already.
Yeah. Thank you
Thanks
for your answer.
Anna, for
very
answer.
interesting.
Well, and just to add a couple of seconds to it, on top of everything that Anna said, we are able to offer all the certification and testing in line with all the standards that were presented in those slides. So, of course, that will cover the domain of going from consumer devices all the way to medical, industrial, vehicles, telecommunication, enterprise IoT, and so on.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you devoting time, allocating time for this presentation. It has been very informational, however. I was never so aware of the security threats that we're facing today, and probably even more afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for organizing, and feel free to reach Anna or I for any other questions as a follow-up of this presentation. And please enjoy the rest of the conference as well.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Okay.
For those that are watching, the starting of the next program will be at 2 p.m. Fortunately, there aren't any more questions, so you will be free. I do also, again, I do encourage everyone to connect with the Secura company and with Anna and Razvan on the Connect2B platform to use the opportunity to develop businesses and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.